We continue now at the top of Daf Memches Amud Aleph in Meseches Sotah. This is Sotah Daf 48a. The Gemara is discussing the fact that Yochanan Kohen Gadol abolished the Hodas HaMaiser, and the Gemara is now explaining that the reason is because Maiser Rishon is supposed to be given to the Leviim, V'anon Ko Yehavinon LeKohanim, but we don't give it to the Leviim, we give it to the Kohanim, and that's why we abolish this idea of the confession of the Maiser to say that we gave the Maisers properly, if in fact we're giving it to the Kohanim instead of the Leviim. Rashi here explains, V'anon Yehavi LeKohanim, the Konsinu Ezra. The reason why we give it to the Kohanim is because Ezra gave a fine to the Leviim that they wouldn't be able to receive this Maiser Rishon. It would go to the Kohanim instead. Kedamrin and Yavamis. This is explained in Yavamis. The Kevan de'enon nos and ketiknan. Since we don't give it in the proper fashion, so to speak, ein yecholin lomar. We can't say the words begam nesativ lelevi kechol mitzvasel. We can't say we gave it to the Levi like you commanded, because again, we're actually giving it to the Kohanim. But the Gemara continues, V'lo de ashar meiser. So why don't we just do a confession or admit that he gave the other meisers? Forget about the Maiser Rishon and just speak about the other meisers. And the Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish says, Kol bayishein misvad al Maiser Rishon. Any house that's not doing the vidoy on Maiser Rishon, shuva ein misvad al shar meiser. So it's not going to do the vidoy on other meisers. Once you're not doing Maiser Rishon, you don't do the others. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Amar Abaye says, Hoelu pasuk bo akasav tchila, because the pasuk, the first one that it speaks about, is actually the Maiser Rishon, so that one becomes primary. And Rashi explains, Techila v'nasata la-levi zem Maiser Rishon. It says la-levi, that refers to Maiser Rishon. It's the first one in the pasuk. La-ger zem Maiser Ani. La-ger refers to Maiser Ani. B'sharecha zem Maiser Sheni. B'sharecha refers to Maiser Sheni. D'chsiv lo sucha lechol b'sharecha. So again, the Maiser Rishon is the primary one. And the Gemara continues, Mechlal da'afrushe have a mifrashi. Now, this entire discussion implies that they were separating Maiser Rishon. The only thing they weren't doing was they weren't giving it to the Leviim, they were giving it to the Kohanim. But the problem is, Vatanya, but we learned in a Brisa, Afu bitel es havidoy v'gazar l'demai. Not only did he nullify the vidoy, he also made a gezerah on demai. And what's the reason why he made a gezerah that anyone who gets from an Amoritz has to separate? Lefisha shalach b'chol gvul Yisrael, because he sent out messengers throughout the boundaries of Israel. V'ran, he saw she'ein mafrishin ela truma gedola bilvad, that they were only separating Truma Gedola, they were only separating the primary Truma, Maiser Rishon and Maiser Sheni, Miksasan Ma'asrin, Miksasan and Ma'asrin. When it came to Maiser Rishon and Maiser Sheni, some were taking off the Maiser and some were not taking off the Maiser. And Amar Lahem, so he said to them, B'ni bo v'omer lachem kashem shetruma gedola yesh ba'avon misa, my sons, let me come and let me tell you that just like truma gedola, there is a sin of death if it's not separated properly. Kach trumas meiser v'tevel, the same thing is true by trumas meiser and tevel. Trumas meiser is when you give the Maiser Rishon to the Levi, so he has to separate a tenth and give it to the Kohen. That also is going to have the same kind of a punishment. And also tevel, let's say you just have grain that you didn't separate properly. You have produce that you didn't separate properly. Yesh bohen avon misa. There is over there a sin that is worthy of death as well. And so Amad v'hiskin lahem. So therefore he stood up and he made the following takana: halokach peiros me'amaretz, that if somebody buys produce from an amaretz, mafresh me'an Maiser Rishon or Maiser Sheni, he has to separate from it Maiser Rishon, Maiser Sheni, in case it wasn't separated properly. And Maiser Rishon mafresh mimena trumas Maiser, and on the Maiser Rishon he has to separate trumas Maiser v'nosan l'kohen. The trumas Maiser goes to the Kohen. Or Maiser Sheni ola v'ochla b'Yerushalayim. The Maiser Sheni should be brought up and eaten in Yerushalayim. Maiser Rishon or Maiser Ani. Now, as far as Maiser Rishon and Maiser Ani is concerned, so there it's really just a situation of a monetary issue. Does it belong to the Levi? Does it belong to the Ani? There's no kedusha in terms of eating it. Anyone can eat it. So over there we apply the principle hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. There we apply the principle of hamotzi mechaver olav haraya, because you can't really prove, the Ani or the Levi can't really prove that it wasn't separated. This is all being done out of a suffix, and so therefore you separate it, but he's allowed to keep it. And so the Gemara now has a question, because it sounds like from here they were not separating Maiser Rishon. And to that the Gemara answers, Tarti Tiken, the Yochanan Kohen Gadol actually made two takonas. Bitel vidoy de chaverim. Number one, he nullified the confession that the chaverim make. The chaverim are the ones who we know have separated the Maiser Rishon. The gazer al demai shel amei haaretz. And then in terms of the demai of amei haaretz, so amei haaretz we're not sure if they took off Maiser Rishon. So there he made a gezerah that if you get from an amei haaretz, you have to separate the Maiser Rishon in that situation. And so the Gemara therefore has a question that it sounds like they weren't separating the Maiser from here. And the Gemara answers, Tarti Tiken. Yochanan Kohen Gadol, he made two takanas. Bitol vidoy de chaverim. Number one, he nullified the confession of the chaverim. The chaverim separated the Maiser, but they wouldn't do the confession again because they gave the Maiser Rishon to the Kohanim and not the Leviim. And second, v'gazer al demai shel amei haaretz. He made a gezerah on demai of amei haaretz, meaning by the amei haaretz, there's a concern that they didn't separate Maiser at all, and therefore there was a gezerah that if you get produce from an amei haaretz, so you have to separate the Maiser. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'afu bitalas ha'ma'orim." He also abolished the awakeners. My ma'orim. What are the awakeners? Amar Rachva says, "B'chol yom v'yom shayuomdim leviim al duchen." Every single day the Leviim would be on the platform. V'yomrim, and they would say, "Uro lama sishan Hashem, awaken Hashem. Why are you sleeping?" Amar Leni said to them, "V'chiyei she'ena lifnei hamakom." Is there sleeping before Hakadosh Baruch Hu? V'alok var nemar. Doesn't the pasuk already say, "Hinei lo yonim v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael"? It says the guardian of Israel doesn't slumber, doesn't sleep. Ella, rather, what does it mean? Bisman she Yisrael shruyin b'tzar. If Klal Yisrael is in a situation of pain, v'ovdei kochavim b'nachas v'shalva, and the idol worshippers are in comfort and peace, l'kach nemar uro lama sishan Hashem. In those situations, we say, "Awaken, why are you sleeping, Hashem?" But in his days already, in the days of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, things were good for the Jewish people, so it wasn't appropriate to say this pasuk. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'yes hanokfim," that Yochanan Kohen Gadol he also abolished. He also nullified the strikers. My nokfim. What are the nokfim? What are the strikers? Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, "Shayu mesartin le'egel bein karnav." They would scratch the calf between its horns, kedei sheyipol dam be'enav. That way the blood would fall into its eyes, and in that way they would be able to shecht it more easily. And so the Gemara says, "Asa iu batel." So he came along, Yochanan Kohen Gadol came along, and he nullified that. Mishum demichsi kimuma, because that already looked like a mum. It looked like a blemish. And the Gemara continues, "B'masnisa ton," in the Brisa they taught shayu chovden oso b'makolos, that they would beat it with staffs, kederach she'osan oso lefnei avodas kochavim, like they do in front of the idols. Amar lahem, he said to them, "Ad mosei atem ma'achilim nevelos lamizbeach." Until when are you going to give the mizbeach these nevelos? And the Gemara says, "What do you mean nevelos?" Nevelos sounds like an animal that dies on its own. Hashachidlu, in this case they're shechting, they're still slaughtering the carbon. Ela trephos, what he meant to say was, there's a problem here of trephos, that maybe you're putting a wound on this animal that would cause it to die, which would make it not a kosher animal. Shamanikev krom shel moach, maybe if you're going to strike it, you're going to end up making a hole in the membrane that surrounds the brain. So Amad v'hiskin lohem tabos bekarka. So therefore he instituted that they put rings in the ground, and they would put the animals' heads in the rings, and that was a way to control the animals when they were slaughtering them. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, "Ad yamav hayapatish makab Yerushalayim," until his days, the hammers would strike in Yerushalayim. And the Gemara explains, "B'cholo shel moed." We're talking about a chol moed. Yochanan Kohen Gadol stopped the blacksmiths from using the hammers on chol moed because it would make a lot of noise, and people would wrongly assume that you're allowed to do any kind of malacha on chol moed. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Kol yamav lo haya adam tzarich lishol ala demai." In all of his days, a person did not need to ask about demai. And again, Keda'amran, as we said before, because he made a takana that people, anytime you receive produce from an Amoritz, you have to separate the meisers because of the concern. And Rashi explains tabo, so he instituted these rings in the Beis Hamikdash, lahachnis savar behem lasocho, again to put the neck of the animal in the ring, a way to control the animal when you're slaughtering it. And Keda'amrinan, as we said, shatiken shiu kol halochin mafrishin. Yochanan Kohen Gadol made a takana that anybody who purchases produce from an Amoritz has to separate meisers. V'lo haya adam tzarich lishol lechaver chaver shalokach me'amoritz hifrash the demai. So nobody needed to ask his friend who was a chaver, who got the produce from an Amoritz, did you separate demai? Because there was already a takana that everyone had to separate demai in such a situation. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Misha Batla Sanhedrin, from the time the Sanhedrin was disbanded, Batal Hashir mi Beis Hamishto. So they nullified singing at the wine feasts. Shenemar, as it says, Bashir lo yishtu yayin v'gomer, it says again, with song, there shouldn't be song together with wine. Misha Mesu Nevi'im Harishonim, from the time that the early prophets died, Batlu Urim V'tumim, the Urim V'tumim, they were nullified. Mishachara Beis HaMikdash, from the time the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Batal HaShamir, the Shamir was nullified. The Shamir was a worm that was used to help in building, to assist in building and cutting the stones of the Beis HaMikdash. And also V'nofes Sufim, also the Nofes Sufim was also Batal, and that will be explained in the Gemara. Upasko Anshe Amon, and men of faith, they ceased Yisrael. They ceased from being part of Klal Yisrael. Shenemar, as it says, Hoshia Hashem ki gomar chassid v'gomer. Again, it says, save Hashem, because the chassid is no longer. And the Gemara continues. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Hayed Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua testified, Miyom shechara Beis Hamikdash, from the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Ein Yom she'ein bo klala. There's no day without curse. V'lo yard hatal lebracha, and the dew no longer comes down as a blessing. V'nitel tam haperos, and the taste from the fruits has been taken away. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi Saf Nitel Shuman Haperos, even the cream from the fruits, so to speak, has been taken away. It's not as nourishing. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Hatahara Notla es hatam v'esareach. when the purity stopped, so the taste and the smell, they got taken away. Hamaisrus, and when the maisrus stopped, natlu as shuman hadagon, so then the fat from the grain, again the nourishing elements of the grain, they ceased. The chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say, has nus v'akshafim, these nus, and the kshafim, the sorcery, kilu as hakol, they destroyed everything. And the Gemara says, how does the Mishnah know that it was from the time that the Sanhedrin was disbanded that the shir, the song, was nullified from the Beis HaMishtos, from the wine feasts? In other words, the pasuk that's brought, Bashir lo yishtu yayin, doesn't have any reference to the Sanhedrin. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yoshua says, the Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Zekenim Mishar Shavasu, B'Achurim Miniginasam. There's another pasuk that says, when the elders, that's talking about the Sanhedrin, again, when that's disbanded, so then B'Achurim Miniginasam. So then the younger men, they cease to have the singing. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav says, Udna Deshama Zimra Tayakir. The ear that hears song, it should be uprooted. Again, the idea that song should no longer be permitted after the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Amar Rava says, Zimra bebeisa churba besifa. If you have song in the house, that means there's destruction by the threshold. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Kol Yishorer bachalon cherev basaf. Again, if you have singing, then you have this destruction by the threshold. Ki arza eira. And the Gemara now explains those last three words, my ki arza eira. What does it mean, ki arza eira? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Bayis hamasubach ba'arazim. Let's say you have a house that is enclosed in cedar. Irhu, is that like a city? Ela afilu bayis hamasubach ba'arazim. What it really means to say is, even if you have a house that's enclosed in cedar that seems to be very well protected, misroeya, that house will crumble if there is song. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Ashi says, Shmami, no, we see from this, Ki maschel churba, where does destruction begin from? B'seifa mischal, it begins by the threshold. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Chora basaf, again, that's the pasuk we quoted above, there's desolation by the threshold. V'bay same mehach, if you want, I could say from here, from the following pasuk, U'she'iyah yukas shar, she'iyah will destroy by the gates. She'iyah is a reference to the demons. Amar Mar bar Rav Ashi says, L'didi chazile, I saw this demon, u'menagach chitur, it gores and it creates destruction like an axe. And Rashi explains, U'she'iyah loshen beis hashoa mein yoshev, that's a language of saying it's a desolate area, there's no one there. Umitoch kachem, because it's so desolate, se'irim meraknim sham, again the demons, they're dancing over there, u'menachin v'kosin es sha'arav, and they gore and they destroy the gates. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna says, Zimra denagdi udebakri shari, the songs that are sung by those who are pulling the boats by ropes, and the bakri refers to those who are plowing the fields, that is permitted because that music is needed, that song is needed in order to help them to do the work. The gardoy yasser, but the song of the weavers, that is prohibited. Rashi over here explains, Zimra denagdi moshche sfinos, again they pull the boats bachevel with ropes. Shari, that's permitted. Sheinu lezarzim v'malachtam, that's a way of encouraging them to do their work. With the bakri shemizamrin b'shasha chorshin, they make music, they sing at the time that they're plowing. Ve'enu el lechavin es hashvarim, that's a way of guiding the oxen latalmeim to the proper rows, to the proper furrows. Shahochin l'kol hashir dariv aleim, because they're able to walk to the sound of the music. But the gardai, when it comes to the song of the weavers, Einu el ischok, that's only to be lighthearted, and therefore that is not permitted after the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues, Rav Huna batel Zimra, Rav Huna did not allow song, again because the Beis HaMikdash had been destroyed, and this was a good thing, and therefore kamemeya avzi bezuzah, 100 ducks you could get for just one zuz, meaning the economy was good. Umeya sachite bezuzah, you could also get 100 sa of wheat for a zuz, veloi boy, and even that, people didn't even want to spend that much because there was such an abundance. Asar Rav Chisda, then Rav Chisda came along, zalzel bey, he was mezalzel in that practice, he allowed song, and so then he boy avza bezuzah, so then if you wanted to find a duck even for one zuz velo mishtakach, you weren't able to find it. In other words, the economy, it went in the wrong direction. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yosef says, Zimri gavri v'ani nashi, let's say you have a situation where men are singing and the women are responding, pritzusa, that's referred to as pritzas. Zimri nashi v'ani gavri, if the women are singing and the men are responding, that's even worse, that's ke'esh ben oris, that's like flames hitting the wood chips, and they're going to create a large fire, a lot of destruction. And the Gemara says, Lamai nafkamina, what difference does it make? They're both bad, so why are we describing how bad each one is? And the Gemara explains, we're saying that if you have to choose between one of them, so the worst one should be nullified, and we would prefer the one that's not as bad. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Kalashosa barba mine zemer, anybody who drinks wine together with 4 kinds of music, Mevi chamish paranios lo'olam, brings 5 punishments to the world. The idea is there's the sin of wine over here, plus the 4 different kinds of instruments. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Hoy mashkime baboker shecher yirdofu, me'achrei beneshev yain yadlikim, it's talking about people drinking in the mornings and late into the night. Vayakinor v'nevel tofe chalil, and these are the 4 different kinds of musical instruments. V'yayin mishteyem espoel Hashem lo yabitu, again, they're doing all of these sins. And maksiv acharav, what does it say after that? What are all the various punishments? The pasuk continues in Yeshayahu, Lachein gola ami miblidas, shegormen golos liolam. The first is golos, that there's exile. Uchvodo mesei rav, shemevin rav laolam. Then it says uchvodo mesei rav. That's a reference to the famine that will come to the world. V'hamono tzichet sama shegormen letorah shetishdakach milam da. Then the pasuk talks about thirst, meaning it causes that the Torah is forgotten from those who learn it. And the pasuk in Yeshayahu goes on, Vayisha chodam vayishpalish, that man is lowered. What does that mean? Shegormen shiflus lesono shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It actually means there's a lowering to the enemy of God, which really refers to God. That God himself becomes lowered because of this. V'yein isha HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the word ish over here is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shenemar Hashem ish milchama. And finally, ve'enei gavom tishpalna. What does that mean? Shegormen shiflus shel Yisrael. The Klal Yisrael also is lowered. Umaksiv achrav. And what does it say right after that? Lachein, therefore. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Memches Amud Beis.